very much, Mr. Cletus, for having me on this prestigious occasion of the African Languages Week. I wish you all a happy African Languages Week 2025. Initially, when I presented the proposal to the Specialized Technical Committee, Youth, Culture and Sport, we had proposed 24 to 30 January due to the fact that the mission for the African Academy of Languages, Makalan, began operating on January 24, 2001. When former President of Mali, His Excellency Alpha Oumar Konaré, established it by presidential decree on December 19, 2000. President Konaré subsequently became the first chairperson of the African Union after its transformation from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union in 2002. However, after the inaugural edition, we encountered some difficulties in marking the event. Firstly, that initial period usually coincides with the resumption of many from Christmas and New Year holidays. At the African Union also, many things are not yet finalized. Secondly, African Union summits usually take place during this period, which further makes things difficult for us. After consultation, we thought that it would be more convenient to have the dates moved a little further. During the fourth Specialized Technical Committee, Youth, Culture and Sport, that took place at the African Union Commission from 22 to 26 May 2023, I presented the proposal for the change of dates and the reasons to the Committee of Honorable Ministers that adopted it unanimously. The proposal was further adopted by the 43rd Ordinary Session of the Executive Council during the 5th Media Coordination Meeting of the African Union, Regional Economic Communities and Regional Mechanisms, which took place from 13 to 16 July 2023 in Nairobi, Kenya. At the same Media Coordination Meeting, the final adoption was done by the heads of state and government. From the third edition 2024, the African Languages Week is officially programmed from 21 to 28 February. Akalan's proposal for a decade of African languages alongside the International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022-2032 of the United Nations to be implemented within Akalan's mandate and programs was also adopted, as well as our proposal to revise the African Union's Language Plan of Action for Africa to incorporate the Assembly decision on Kiswahili as a working language of the African Union and language of wider communication in Africa. We will note now that the African Languages Week coincides with the United Nations Mother Language Day, which will make it easier for the African countries to mark both events whose objectives are not different. The African Academy of Languages is the African Union specialized language institution whose mandate is to develop and promote African languages, the use of African languages as a means of fostering the integration and socio-economic development of the African continent. ACALAN is responsible for empowering African languages so that they can be used in all domains of life by encouraging the formulation and implementation of dynamic and articulated language policies, as well as the sharing of experiences in policy development and implementation in the African Union member states as a means of using African languages in a wider range of domains. The Secretariat, under my leadership, came up with two major proposals in 2017 and 2018. One, the African Languages Week proposal, and two, Kiswahili as a working language of the African Union and language of wider communication in Africa. One day I was invited to speak online in the celebration of the Chinese Language Day on April 20. I have always been called to take part in Language Day and Week celebration events. After presenting my paper on behalf of the African Union, I sat back in my office and talked to myself. You always go and talk about the importance of celebrating non-African languages. What about African languages? Then I started researching how the celebration of these languages is presented. It was in this manner in late 2017 that I formulated the proposal, and the then Senior Project and Program Officer, Dr. Ojo Babajide Johnson, and I fine-tuned it. The proposal was presented to the governing board of ACALAN, which is the Academy's highest policy organ, for endorsement. Then it was presented to the African Union's third specialized technical committee on youth, culture and sport in October 2018 in Algiers, Algeria, which unanimously adopted it. After its adoption by the Executive Council and the subsequent endorsement of the heads of state and government of the African Union, we proudly launched the African Languages Week in collaboration with the government of Burkina Faso in Ouagadougou in July 2021. At the Ouagadougou launching, one of the major recommendations was that ACALAN should establish the Continental Standing Committee to assist the Secretariat in the planning and organization of the event. A 25-member African Languages Week Coordinating Committee, composed of members from the 5 regions of Africa plus its diaspora, was immediately established, respecting the African Union's policy of geographic spread. The committee was coordinated by Professor Wangui Wagoro, a Kenyan academic, social critic, researcher, translator, and writer. During the inaugural edition of the African Languages Week in 2022, She was succeeded by Mrs. Margaret Nankinga from Uganda, also coordinator of Akalan's Luganda, Luzoga, Lugwere Vehicular Cross-Border Language Commission. The main role of the committee is to stimulate more dynamism for the development and promotion of African languages across the African continent and in the diaspora. The committee assists Akalan in the annual celebration and ensures the smooth running of the activities of the African Languages Week by proposing the theme for each year and mobilizing resources, human, technical, and financial, for planning and organizing the activities of the week throughout the continent and in the diaspora, in collaboration with the national language structures in the member states serving as Akalan's national focal institutions through communication, advocacy, and lobbying. In 2002, which was the inaugural edition, the African Languages Week Coordinating Committee identified the theme as African Languages, Levers for the Africa We Want, in line with the African Union's theme for 2021. In 2023, the committee chose African languages for sustainable food security, cultural and socioeconomic development for the Africa we want, also in line with the African Union theme for 2022. The theme for the third edition was Empowering African Languages for Quality Education and Free Trade for the Africa we want, reflecting again on the themes of the African Union for 2023 and 2024, which were acceleration of the African Continental Free Trade Area and Education and Skill Africa for the 21st century, respectively. The African Languages Week Coordinating Committee also identified 5 sub-themes for the 2024 edition of the African Languages Week. 1. Developing and implementing policies for African languages empowerment. 2. Multilingualism for quality education and free trade across Africa. 3. African languages as foundation for literacy and education in Africa. 4. Cross-border languages as levers for digitalization and free cross-border trade in Africa. 5. Literacy is the ability to read and write in the mother tongue. The committee also identified 2 key activities that, if carried out by all member states of the African Union, would mobilize Africa's populace and governments to achieve the objectives of the theme. The 2 events are: 1. Public talks through which committee members and members of the civil society would work with governments and non-governmental organizations to organize public talks on empowering African languages for quality education and free trade. 2. Media campaigns on African language promotion to urge parents and caregivers to buy books in African languages for their children and community libraries, book donations and children's reading competitions inclusive. The theme for this 4th edition, 2025, is African languages, voices for reparations, justice, and the dignity of the people for the Africa we want. Again, reflecting on the African Union theme for 2025. And the sub-themes are African languages, voices for restoration of the dignity of the people of African descent. 2. breaking the chains of linguistic oppression, reparations, and language empowerment for Africans and people of African descent. 3. Promoting African languages for digital inclusion, transformation, and social justice. The slogan for this year's edition 2025 is "My language, my heritage, my dignity." The African Languages Week is an awareness call. Therefore, we Africans have to be dedicated to the promotion of African cultures and languages. The African Languages Week is a time of reflection, a time of suggestions, a time of propositions, a time of efforts and action to develop African languages and promote their use as a factor of African integration and development, peace and prosperity. The fact that Africa is the most linguistically diverse continent in the world, we cannot continue to rely on the former colonial languages that only about 30% of Africans, of the African population, understand and use, to the detriment of African languages. The majority understands best and use. We are emphasizing that Akalan is not against any language. We are just standing for linguistic justice and democracy. We acknowledge that all languages are important to their speakers, especially. Languages are assets, particularly to their speakers. Firstly, all languages are partner languages for Akalan. However, we cannot continue to rely on foreign languages alone that only a small portion of the African population understand and use, to the detriment of our languages that most people understand and use. I would like to emphasize that cultural development is inevitably one of the main factors of the sustainable development of a people. The development of African languages as one of the main pillars of African cultures is therefore an indispensable factor in Africa's integration and development. We therefore call on our leaders and policymakers to provide the necessary support for our efforts to develop and promote our values and cultures. We also call on the civil society to double their effort so that African languages can become effective working and official languages and languages of instruction in the existing multilingual context. A happy African Languages Week to you all. Long live the African Union. Long live the African Academy of Languages. Long live the African Languages Week.